she? I guess that's allowed.
She's
Once
helping?
in a while.
She's either helping or trapping us in here.
Oh,
She's
okay,
not in
gotcha.
today.
Take the kids out for the Yeah.
Huh? Did you make more noise?
No. No.
Do not ask questions you don't want to answer.
Right. If they weren't already doing things, yeah.
I'm going to have an adventure later today.
And,
I'm
get
helping
the
move
kids all
furniture.
together. Alright, baby, we're gonna go see Mama.
Such
I'm
as
right here.
Oh,
I was gonna say.
Mama.
Wow, ignoring your wife.
So this morning, Sean and Hal have the same level of object permanence.
Let's just push my tire out the whole way.
Yeah, show that to Mama.
It's not exactly like it, but like where's my wife?
Oh, that was probably me not taking that from her. Sorry, guys. Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
And thanks for joining us for our hour of Sunday school. We will continue our study on the disciples.
Becky.
Yes, sir.
But I want to give everybody a quick heads up. This morning we had a very sudden gust and a power flicker. And if that happens to all our folks online and to you guys, expect just a hard reset of everything. So we'll lose all our online folks, but we'll still have a good time in the meanwhile, and hopefully we don't get any big gusts to throw things off. So, anywho, this morning we continue our study as we look at Christ and we look at the Passion Week. In particular, we begin with perhaps the most important section with Peter. Peter, as we've had on the board for a number of weeks now, has been anticipating to deny Jesus, and as we know from the scriptures, will deny Jesus at one of the most crucial moments. So
He would never.
as your time to go, Mama.
He said he wouldn't.
Yeah, he said he would.
He said he
not going
wouldn't,
to.
but here we are.
He's so showing myself he cut off an ear.
And so that is the story we will begin with this morning. We have our Mark, our Matthew, and our Luke. We are missing a John this morning.
We're missing both of them.
Missing both our Johns. Our spare Matthew, our spare John, and our regular John. Could I have a volunteer to read our John passages, which are many until Gretchen arrives at surprise? He's got it.
You gotta wait till I'm sitting down.
Yes, that is absolutely right.
I never learned how to read, so I can't do it.
So we will have,
Aren't you reading her?
and really as we look at this most crucial moment in the stories of the Gospels, every author has something to say on almost every topic, with just a few of them differing as to which events they will include. So we will look at everyone, and as we go through each circumstance, we will, again, as always, we look at these with the perspective of the disciples, those that follow Jesus, the 12 in particular, that witness Jesus as he goes to the cross. We ended last week with his arrest and his dragging before the Sanhedrin, which really puts us in the position to understand Jesus, I should say the disciples' collapse of their theology. In a moment, they went from believing that they would have the kingdom at their disposal alongside Christ to recognizing that the warnings of Christ, of his death and removal, are very much more literal than they had anticipated. So, after Jesus was brought before Annas and Caiaphas, brought before the high priests, plural, in the beginning of the trial, we see Peter outside of the courtrooms while Jesus is really preparing for trial, not really on trial with the Roman government yet, just being condemned by the Jewish people. Peter sits outside, and we will read a couple different portions of passages which discuss his denial, and we'll discuss the differences between them. So, not
No, my arm locked up.
There's
Sorry.
a little bit of bouncing around to do. So I'll give you guys your passages before we read. Mark, we'll have you in chapter 14, Becky, verse 54, and then we're going to skip ahead to 66 through 72.
I don't know how to read, Sean. What are you doing?
He's been reading for weeks.
Huh?
Solely. Mark 14:54, and then 66 through 72. Noah, I'll have you read Matthew 26, verse 58, and then skip to 69 through 75. Isaiah, you're straight through. Luke 22:54 through 62. And then Henry, I'll have you read for us John 18:15 through 18, and then we'll skip ahead to 25 through 27. The reason for all this is the Gospels record these a little bit more chronologically. Only Luke kind of groups these instances together, but we get a different perspective on Peter's denials from each of the four Gospels. So let's take a look first at Mark. Mark 14, verse 54, and then 66 through 72.
Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. As Peter was below the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, looked at him and said, "You are also with Jesus at the Nazarene." But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you are talking about," and he went out to the porch. The servant girl saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, "This is one of them." But again he denied it, and after a little while the bystanders were again saying to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, you are a Galilean too." But he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man you are talking about." Immediately a rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had made the remark to him, "Before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he began to weep.
Thank you very much. I think the only confusion in Mark so far, we'll dive right into each of the passages.
We'll jive into Matthew.
Becky did not read, from her translation, the instance of the first rooster crowing, which some Bibles may include. That's just there for, kind of an addition for clarity, not necessarily in the original text. So, if you're confused by that, that's the circumstance going on.
Sorry, I was reading the NASB.
No, don't be sorry. I think it's important to bring that up. There's nothing wrong with that at all. So, but it's good to point that out. So for those of you that may be confused, but I think you guys at this point understand the differences between translations because we've been there. So
Actually, I'm going through that in my English class right now.
Oh,
Differences in translations. I'm like, haha!
You're ready to go. I love it. So no, can you pick up for us Matthew 26, verse 58, and then 69 through 75, please?
But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And he came inside and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a slave woman came to him and said, "You too were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you're talking about." When he had gone to the gateway, another slave woman saw him and said to those who were there, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." A little later, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "You really are one of them as well, since even the way you talk gives you away." They began to curse and swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the statement that Jesus made, "Before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly.
Thank you very much. Very similar to what we have in Mark from Matthew. So go ahead and read for us Isaiah, Luke 22, 54 through 62.
Then took they him, and led him, and brought him into the high priest's house. And Peter followed afar. And when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall, and were sat down together, Peter sat down among them. But a certain maid beheld him, and sat by the fire, and earnestly looked upon him, and said, "This man was also with him." He denied him, saying, "Woman, I know him not." And a little while another saw him, and said, "Thou art also of them." And Peter said, "Man, I am not." And about the space of an hour after, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Of the truth, this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." And Peter said, "Man, I know not what thou sayest." And immediately, while yet he spake, the cock crew. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter, and Peter remembered the words the Lord the word of the Lord, how he said unto him, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And Peter went out and wept bitterly.
So according to Luke, Peter just hit him with the yo no hablo inglés.
So
Man, I don't
what
know.
is in Luke the major difference here? The major difference between Matthew and Mark that we see, Sharon?
Christ turned and looked at him.
Yeah, it just hits so much harder. And we know from Luke and from John the back and forth. You know, he's going in between the high priest's homes, and it's during this time where Jesus actually looks towards Peter and sees him, and you know, it's the instant realization is just so much more. I mean, the rooster crowing, the prophecy fulfilled, like that's huge. But to see the eyes of Jesus and watch your Lord that you are actively denying, like that just like from Peter's perspective, that we understand the weeping bitterly that each of the gospel writers are careful to remark on.
It also really emphasizes or shows how close he was to Christ,
Yeah.
you know, because otherwise you read that, you're like, okay, so he's around that area,
Yeah. Mhm.
but here, you know, he can actually see him.
Very good. Yeah, you can picture really and I'm not sure all the buildings and how they look like, but you know, these things of like the sandstone like structures of Middle Eastern buildings we see in depictions of this. And you see a little fire burning outside of them, you know, in between courthouses and buildings. And really it's, you know, the distance of like a backyard to the door is what you see with Jesus being carried from house to house, with Jesus sitting out, or Peter sitting outside with the fire with the servants. You know, he's with the servants of the people inside, so they're not far. And so Peter, as a servant of the Lord, comes, but while he sits as a servant, he denies. You'll see too some minor differences between like who exactly is addressing Peter. You know, man, a maid servant, the crowds. I don't think any of those are super significant. You know, as much as the 3 times they're addressed by various people is what's at play here. But other than that, like that looking on Jesus is like that is the moment of Luke. I feel like it makes all the difference. Cool, very good. Then let's read John as well. John 18, 15 through 18, and then 25 through 27.
Now Simon Peter followed Jesus and another disciple, and that disciple was known to the high priest. Therefore he went in with Jesus into the hall of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out the other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake to her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Then said the maid that kept the door unto Peter, Art thou not also one of this man's disciples? He said, I am not. And the servants and officers stood there, for which he had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter also stood amongst them, and warmed himself. And Simon Peter stood, warmed himself. And they said unto him, Art thou not also of the disciples? He denied it, and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, his cousin, whom Peter spoke off, said, Did I not see thee in the garden with him? Then Peter denied again, and immediately the cock crew.
Okay, thank you very
And
much.
Peter did not go out and weep bitterly.
Yeah. No, very much so. We have 2 other additions here. One of them is just from the perspective of John, that John, the other disciple, goes with Peter. He's not the only one to follow near Jesus. John is actually the one to kind of instigate, hey, let's go get closer to him. It's during this transition where John and Peter walk into the courtyard where one of the maiden of the high priest says, hey, I recognize you. Not John, but Peter, the prominent one. And Peter says, no, I don't know. Warming his hands by the fire comes the second, and then the third one comes, we know from John, one of the servants of the high priest being a kinsman or a cousin whose ear Peter cut off. So unmistakably, this person knows Peter. And so this one from the crowds, as is described in Mark and Matthew, he is the one to address Peter, call him out for being with Jesus. And so this is just really it's a remark of every moment of, this whole ordeal, the recent events that just hit Peter so hard. The denial at the Last Supper, the arrest where the disciples are scattered, all of these events just bring an immense amount of shame
It didn't help when John came out and said to Peter right in front of that girl, "Are you going to go in and say anything or not?"
Yeah, right. Right. So yeah, it's you get that perspective, right? Of they're so close, like they should be near to Jesus, but it's the fear, it's the let's talk about that. This is the moment, what Peter is going through. That's the moment we're here to settle on. We talked about Peter's denial way back during the Last Supper. We've left this on the board for such a moment as this, and we talked about what has to come undone with Peter's denial. What is this moment, this temptation of Satan, really, as Jesus puts it? What is this humbling Peter with? And as we look at all the different aspects of Peter and what are wrapped up into the denial that Jesus says that he's going to commit, we see really the challenges and how they're all kind of broken down in this one moment. We talked about, with the main aspect of Peter under confrontation at the Last Supper is his pride. Do you remember the conversation taking place at the Last Supper that Jesus has to address? Yeah.
I'm the greatest disciple, and I'm gonna get the fancy chair.
Yeah, which one of us is going to be the greatest? And so he's addressing this aspect of pride at the Last Supper, which comes to fruition here with Peter's denial. I'm the greatest disciple. Yet the greatest disciple is the one to utterly deny Jesus in the moment of need. There's also, the other big aspect we talked about was Peter's commitment and his motivations for following Christ. How is this challenged? How does this moment really undo all this? Yeah, I say, go ahead.
Well, this is right after. Well, not right after, but this is after he does he cut off the high priest's servant's ear, and he was ready for an earthly kingdom, an earthly revolution. He was not ready for Jesus to just let himself be captured and put himself to death, allow himself to be put to death like this, because we all know that Jesus could have easily called 10,000 angels and taken care of all of this without a single hair on his head being removed or
Yeah.
so it's a moment of weakness because he doesn't, despite of Jesus telling all the disciples, really, I am going to die. I have to die in order for the greater good. It's a moment of just he's being serious.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. The motivation was originally the kingdom, right? That earthly kingdom. And with that commitment tested, the question then becomes, you're following me for this reason. If your reasoning is wrong, will you still follow me? And in this moment, it's tested. And seemingly, in the moment of denial, so we know what happens with Peter after this, so this isn't a condemnation of him forever. But in this moment, in the challenge, Peter fails. Because the question is, will you follow me despite, your motivations being incorrect, or despite your commitment not being what you thought it was? It's not, and really this is a question that us as Christians and a lot of Christians have to encounter, where we realize that maybe there's something in the Word of God that contradicts the way that we thought, the way that we believed, the way that we've been taught. Will we choose to follow Jesus or something else? And this can be a major problem in our own crisis of faith and for Peter. And again, while this comes undone, this isn't the end for Peter, but it certainly calls him into question. Other major aspects of Peter that are confronted as denial. Let's talk about his leadership. How does this shape his leadership? Go ahead, Isaiah, keep going.
Leaders typically have to be the bravest and be the most level-headed, and Peter never was either. Well, he was the former, being the bravest. Obviously, he was the one that was willing to cut off the man's ear, but he was never really the most logical thinking. He was always shoot first, ask questions never, and now he has to think of a strategy. He has to think on his feet, and that's not his strong suit.
Yeah, it's interesting. Is the greatest aspect of him, his ability to act in the moment, which can sometimes bite him, his speech in the moment is now not, Lord will prepare a tent for you, Lord will go with you to death. It's, I don't know the man. It's out of that reaction of fear. He's not taking the lead anymore. It's reversed. Rather than bravery, I'd rather say confidence, Peter has to act with confidence. As a leader, you have to kind of make a decision, stick with it, right? And even if you make the wrong decision in the moment, you have to be willing to make a confident decision. And that is, that leadership's called into question. Or where Peter, before John, denies Jesus and makes the wrong decision in the moment. Go ahead, Becky.
Two things.
Yeah.
Number one, Peter never had confidence throughout the Gospels. You may be saying, Rebecca, you're insane.
Okay.
I'd say he had impulsivity.
Mhm.
But anytime he was challenged, he either bulked or he kind of just fell apart. He never had the confidence to stand his ground in a way that was actually constructive. He either was defiant or caved. The confidence was never there. It was act first, speak first, do this now, and then when you're challenged, you fall apart. Which is not the leader that Christ was looking for. That's what he was building him towards, but he was not there until Pentecost. Ish. As much as we make fun of Peter for his denial, without this, he would not be the leader he is later.
Yes, exactly.
This is a necessary evil.
Yes.
And while he lacks the leadership now, honestly, John, despite being a goblin, was half the time more of a leader to everyone else than Peter was. Because John stood his ground. A little too much, but John stood his ground. So this is really the shift from John to Peter of being the one to start standing their ground, because we all have our major mess ups spiritually. This was Peter's big one.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And so he needed this denial to actually realize that he never had the confidence. He wasn't the leader he thought he was. He wasn't the Christ follower he thought he was. And to change all of that after Christ's death.
I wouldn't go so far as to say he never had confidence, but you've absolutely got the whole point of this. Because while you could look at the walking on water as the perfect example of what you're saying, the confidence in the moment, but a falter when the opposition comes. There are plenty of moments where Peter does give a confident answer that Jesus is like, yeah,
That's the one.
it. Yeah, that's it.
Not like
But there are
When he said,
the mountain.
yeah.
What's the term?
yeah, and
Transfiguration.
But you are absolutely correct
And
that
also
this is a
when
moment
he
where
said,
all of that gets
What do
challenged.
you think? When he
Where
said
to make a Peter's confronted with that problem. It's not just I've done this in the past. It's a confrontation of wow, I falter and fail. I have to follow through. And this will still be a problem of Peter's even well into the era of the church, which we'll see. But you're right. It does at least show him this glaring problem. Not that I would say never, but it is a problem. the lack of follow through in his leadership, and then the breakdown of that confidence. While I do think he is a confident person in what he says, there is a lot of times where he has to double back on what he's saying or doing. But you've got the major point that this is the moment where Peter's confronted with not just I denied Jesus, but all of his leadership flaws. Where now he has to become, rather than like what we see in the very next section, where after Jesus is condemned, Judas goes and hangs himself. Peter confronts and is restored. So you're absolutely right. Go ahead, Don.
Am I allowed to spoil further into
No, I've never read this book before.
Peter's Peter's life and kind of his character arc.
Like into the
Who are his
Acts and beyond.
No, I'm talking later into John specifically.
No, not yet.
Not yet?
Because you're right. This will come back to John 21, if that's what you're thinking of. Like, John 21 is the next. Like, we're leaving this on the board, and this, we'll see the restoration of all this.
Then I will hold all of my thoughts until
Yes,
John,
I appreciate
John
that.
21.
But you know exactly where I'm going.
Yes.
So you're absolutely right. Yeah. So yeah, his leadership, though, is certainly called into question. The spiritual the spiritual walk he has is certainly called into question. Is, as we've been saying for so long, is he focused on spiritual things or physical things? That standing out and above, the idea that he can stand above everyone, really that falters and fails here completely. Because being the one that everybody recognizes, now he's not willing to embrace that and rather deny it. And his methods too, his methods of confrontation, right? The upfront, in your face, address this now kind of situation falls apart when, like Becky said, that confidence isn't there to actually withstand persecution here. So this is the moment of challenge of all of Peter's character flaws so far. But this is by no means the end of Peter, because he is restored by Christ as we look at all these things in parallel later on in John 21. And then we'll see a transformation of him as we look through the rest of his life. Go ahead.
The one thing I will ask,
Yeah.
because I want to
That's
start.
a lot.
I want to start this rabbit trail. John mentions at the end that with the third recognition, let's say, was someone. It was, hey, you were at the Garden of Gethsemane. Whereas Matthew and Mark say the last person that recognized him talks about his accent.
Yeah.
So, and Luke, yeah. So let's play devil's advocate. What's your thoughts on that one?
Oh, on the difference between
On the difference between.
If we look between them, I thought about going into all that. We can talk about it briefly. I don't want to belabor it too much. This would be a passage people point to and say, look at the contradictions, right? Because twice in Matthew and Mark, they're called maids, the first two people to address them. In Mark, he says the crowd of people, right? But Matthew, Mark, and Luke all agree on the speech as being a part of that betrays them. But they also don't just particularly say one person, it's a crowd of people.
Yes.
Right? Whereas Luke Matthew and Mark say a crowd, Luke says a man, and John names the man, right, in that last one. So I don't think it's too hard to believe that the crowd recognizes his voice, but the man recognizes the person. That would be my reconcile of the last person. And really the other two aren't as specifically named either. I think Mark's the one who says a maiden and a maiden, which is like, that's fine,
Actually, I
Matthew
think Mark
it's
says
not.
it's the same servant girl twice.
So a maid saw him, in verse 69 of Mark, what is it, Mark 14 we read? Yes. A maid saw him again.
Oh, okay.
So
'Cause mine
depending
says
on-
the servant girl saw him.
Yeah, so it could be interpreted either, like maid saw him. Is it the same one or is it a new one?
Yeah, because
I think it's most likely a different one based on what we read in the differences of the text.
in Matthew 71, if you take out the italicized, it does say another saw him. So
Yes.
it's a second person.
Matthew adds that, who that is,
Mhm.
for clear. Not Matthew, but the writers, add that for clarity when it's not actually there. So I think it's not too much to say two generic maidens are the ones to first address him, and then both the crowds and a man call him out finally, before that's all said and done. So that's my interpretation. Maiden, crowds. Crowds and man. Crowds and servant of the high priest. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that. Maybe there's a better reconciliation, but I think that's fair. So, Becky, you had your hand up before. So whether you want to follow up with that or ask your question, go ahead.
Yes.
Why not both? Yeah.
So, so what you're saying is it's not really a random maiden, especially the first time
Well,
it's
yeah.
the servant girl of the high priest, which means she recognized Peter because of Christ and the disciples constantly coming to the temple and challenging the temple's ideas.
Unless they got voted
But
in and they're
also-
the Roman rule.
John went in
No, it's not.
Peter said that the disciple was known unto the high priest and went in with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then went out that other disciple who was known unto the high priest, and spoke unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. So that just
Affirmed.
affirmed, thank you, that to her, oh hey, these guys are together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, so that's the catalyst, I think, really, that set off the, hey, you're with him too.
Right, and I think it could be both. There's certainly a recognition, of the high priest. I think it could be all, because John apparently recognized the high priest and this maiden, right? And she's the one who welcomes in Peter. So it is a maiden of the high priest, you're right, that welcomes him into Richard. So we're pretty specific as to who that person is. We know who that one is. Go ahead, keep going.
So you're a smart man, Sean, and
Okay.
I need you to answer this because you know more than me.
Oh boy.
In the oldest, fossilized, manuscripts of,
Mm-hmm.
I was gonna say fossilized papers, of Mark
We call
that
those
we
manuscripts.
have, does it mention the rooster crowing twice?
I can look. I don't believe it. I think it only talks about him the
Once,
the
cause
second
mine
time.
only says it, yeah.
I believe it's only refers to it the second time, and it's added in with later manuscripts when he crows the first time.
So, I think a lot of the, let's say, discrepancies between the four gospels can really be brought down to three things. Matthew wasn't there. I don't know where he went, but he wasn't there. So he's hearing this from probably Peter and John, who are the only two who were there.
Mm-hmm.
You have Mark, which is mostly Peter's account,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have John, which is the tattletale, and you have Luke, the historian.
Mm-hmm.
So Luke's getting it probably from both Peter and John, and then anyone else that happens to be there. He's just going around with his little notepad asking questions.
No,
Which
it would
they
be a little
got.
scroll.
And this is a very chaotic event.
Mm-hmm.
All of this happening with Peter. You have John bringing the high priest into it. You have the whole crowd of people. You have Jesus'
High priest was right in there.
trial. And it's Passover, so there's people running around everywhere trying to get their Passover done.
Right.
And so, I think the discrepancies, which really, it's the same event, just told a little differently.
Yes, exactly.
I think that adds to the validity of it, because
Mm-hmm.
the events are the same, but the story's not exactly the same.
Right.
And John's was written likely after Peter had died, so now we're no longer trying to not believe Peter, so that helps. But the account in Mark is very, I want to say chaotic compared to the other ones, because it was Peter, because it was very emotional. He probably doesn't even remember most of it, how it actually happened.
Yeah.
So, I just thought that was interesting. I was wondering about the rooster, if that was
Yeah.
Peter remembering it wrong, or...
No, it is. I think ultimately we'll just have after we're done here. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but we'll have to just wait to the end.
He's just
I don't
gonna
wanna
call
belabor
us out
this
on our
point.
heresy.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor this point too much. There is some discrepancies here. We can address them. I think I'll save any more conversation on for the end because there's a lot to dive into.
Sean's
So
gonna take
your thoughts on the
stick.
same Isaiah, we'll talk about that afterwards because there's other thoughts in the Gospels as well that could be shared that would be important to understand it. So sorry to push that on. That's why I thought about talking about it. I was like, no, because we can go down a big rabbit hole here. But we'll just save it for after, and I'll share some thoughts on that. But yeah, gotcha. Afterwards. But yes, when it comes to Peter's denial, just know this is the moment where he's challenged from what Jesus said at the Last Supper, but he will have his moment of restoration for all these things when it's all said and done. So that is the key here. Let us take a look at a couple more passages in scriptures to trace where where Jesus goes from here. Because really, after Peter departs, we know that John follows along, and John's the only one to follow from a distance. After all the disciples were scattered, he is the only one to stay with Jesus during his crucifixion. But really, from this moment forward, we don't really get the disciples there. We see what happens to Jesus. And so, from a distance or first or second hand, the disciples only get to see this apart. Not directly, but from a distance. Whether that be literal distance in the moment or distance of time and secondhand accounts. So we really only read these passages not from the perspective of the disciples, but to know what happened to Jesus. And obviously it's the most important story of the Bible and of our faith. And so we read it really just to put ourselves there. To put ourselves along the story, to witness what happened, and to watch Jesus crucified. And as we do so, we get a better understanding, of what's going on in the times and what's going on in history, but also heartfelt, what's happening to the disciples. So really it becomes no longer, let's look through the eyes of Peter, but let's just put ourselves here in the story. And let's see watch what happens as Jesus is condemned and crucified. After Peter's denial, the gospel accounts discuss the condemnation of the Sanhedrin. He's not only before the high priest, he gets taken before what's called the Sanhedrin, a group of 70 elders made up of all the different religious organizations at the time. And they together are the judicial body, making a decision on Christ's, really on his death. Mark and Matthew really only give one verse about it. The chief priests and the elders assemble and they sentence Jesus to death. It's Luke who gives us any sort of details on this at all. So I'll just have Isaiah read this section, Luke 22:66 through 71.
We're not gonna read Mark 14:53 through 65? That's Jesus before the high priest. I mean, it's fine.
I skipped that. Oh, I'm sorry. We talked about Annas, we didn't talk about Caiaphas. I skipped, that was supposed to be read before. I apologize. So,
I mean, it's fine.
sorry. Really, I'm sorry, I thought we were starting with denial. Essentially what happens is after Jesus is taken before Annas, the highest of high priests, if you remember, his son-in-law Caiaphas is the one who Jesus is brought to next, and that's that whole section there, where false witnesses come against him and the high priest allows him to go before the Sanhedrin. Just because we're too late. And those are essentially the details. And sorry, we're skipping that section. Thank you for calling that out. I do have the scriptures here. I'll let you guys take a look at them later, but we're going to move on first.
Doesn't Peter go before Annas in Acts?
Yes. Yep, he will be before.
So he's outside.
You again?
Yeah.
Annas didn't see him because he was outside denying
the
Jesus.
moment,
correct.
the Roman.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Was it just Peter or was it Peter and John?
John
went
I
in.
think all of the disciples go. At least there are a couple occasions where they're brought before, at least two in Acts. I think at least more than Peter are there, but
Well,
it might have been all
not all of
11
them.
or 12. but-
No, because Judas wasn't there.
You're right. It might have been all 11 or
was too busy being
12 if you want to count the
He was
bias.
too busy
I
buying
can't remember
equipment before he
exactly.
got any
though.
pieces of silver.
Yeah. So, but you're right. This is not the last time Peter will be here before the Sanhedrin. Then it's done in daytime. Here it's done in the cover of night. But after the high priest sentenced Jesus to go before the Sanhedrin, they hear the case and allow it before them. This is what occurred. So Isaiah, if you read for us Luke 22:66 through 71.
And as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him into their council, saying, Art thou the Christ? Tell us. And he said unto them, If I tell you, ye will not believe. And if I also ask you, ye will not answer me, nor let me go. Hereafter the Son of Man sit on the right hand of power of God. And then they all said, Art thou the Son of God? And he said unto them, Yea, say it, that I am. And they said, What need for any further witness? For we ourselves have heard of his own mouth.
Thank you very much. So this situation does happen similarly in Matthew and Mark, but this is really what's happening before the high priest. Luke separates the events between, who he's directly with. But this is the ultimate result of the council. When they press Christ to ask him to tell them who he is, he doesn't say it, but he says, "You will see the Son of Man sit on the right hand of the power of God, or the throne of God." And he's clearly indicating to them what he means. I am the Son of Man. I will sit here forth at the right hand of God. And that to them is certainly blasphemy, and they sentence him to death. So before the high priest, before the whole Sanhedrin, Jesus is sentenced to death for blasphemy. After this, after hearing the sentence, particularly in Matthew 27, 3 through 10, Judas returns the 30 pieces of silver and then goes and hangs himself following this event. We're not going to take a look at that. We're going to save that for a very important conversation about Judas, but that is the next event in line. But then what happens is, as night is over and it's starting to become early morning, the Jewish portion of the council is done, right? The Sanhedrin says, yep, he's going to die. But the Jewish leaders do not have the authority to put somebody to death under Roman rule. That can only happen by the hand of the Romans. And so, now the Sanhedrin has to take this before Pilate. And remember what Jesus is accused of before the Sanhedrin. What was the accusation here?
It was heresy.
More than heresy, blasphemy. The idea that I am God. He's making himself to be God. Which is, before the Jewish people, that's death level event. Probably not as, it can be twisted well enough to be important to the Roman government.
Claiming
which is
to
what
be.
we will see, which is what we'll see here very shortly. So let's, we get a lot from John in this passage. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have similar accounts, so let's take a look at them first. Mark 15, 1 through 5, Matthew 27, verse 2, and then 11 through 14, skipping over the passage of Judas. And then Luke 23, 1 through 5. And then Henry, when we get to John, is John 18, 28 through 38. So go ahead and start for us, Becky, Mark 15, 1 through 5.
Early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and the scribes and the whole council immediately held a consultation. And finding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he said to him, "It is as you say." The chief priests began to accuse him harshly. Then Pilate questioned him again, saying, "Do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so Pilate was amazed.
Okay. So we see Jesus responds with nothing. Pilate is amazed. Again, some differences between the accounts, just keep those in mind as what Mark and Matthew record for us. Go ahead and read for us, Noah, Matthew 27, verse 2, and then 11 through 14.
And they bound him and led him away and handed him over to Pilate the governor. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, "So you are the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he did not offer any answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things are testifying against you?" And still he did not answer him in regard to a single charge. So the governor was greatly amazed.
Okay. So again, it's during the accusations made against him before Pilate that Jesus remains silent. Luke 23, 1 through 5. Please say it.
And the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king." And Pilate asked him, saying, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, saying, "Thou sayest it." And then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, "Is he not fallen, this man?" And then there's a massive map.
I don't think that was in the scripture.
Actually, it's right in between.
And they were more fierce, saying, "He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place." When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether this man was a Galilean.
That's good. Yeah, we'll get there. You'll come back there in just a second. So So just a few smaller details here in Luke. It's not just that he is King of the Jews, it's that he's pronounced as Christ, Messiah, Christos in Greek. That he is that, the Messiah, really the anointed one from long ago. But now the accusation against him is not just that he is king, rivaling Caesar, which is the way they have to twist that before the Roman government, but also that he stirreth up the people. And rebellions in the Roman government, over control so much, was not uncommon. In fact, we read of many people in Josephus' accounts and even in the scriptures where rebellions were quashed by the Roman government. And so this is how they make it an important issue for Pilate. And
Important is
here,
a strong word, he's still confused.
The only,
Yeah.
the only important part in there, because everything else they said was true. They begin to accuse that we found this fellow perverting the nation, which in their mind, his teachings are going against theirs. And then skipping the part about Rome, saying that he himself is Christ the King. Well, he did say that.
yeah.
But they threw in there forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, which is a total lie, because he said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God's.
Yeah.
So, that's their lie to get Pilate to pay attention. Hey, this guy's not paying his taxes.
Well, yes.
It's all
yeah.
about money.
Right.
You
Well,
know?
yeah, there's-
Oh, wait, he's not paying his taxes?
Yeah.
This man,
Oh, we gotta put him to death.
At least
That's-
Judas paid back the 30 pieces of silver.
Right, which is, but even that, none of this is enough to put somebody to death, right? Like, he might stir up, they might say he's stirring up rebellion, but he has done, all this is preemptive accusation. Nothing has been done to say, look, he attacked these people, he put these people to death. It's all just, hearsay of he's causing murmurings.
Are
He
they-
says that we shouldn't do this or that, right?
Are they supposed to stone false prophets to death, though, in the Old Testament law?
They are, yes.
Okay. So that they have a legitimate, in their mind,
Right, and
they
that's
have a
the difference.
legitimate reason to have him put to death.
Right, that's the difference. The Jewish people have no problem putting Jesus to death for blasphemy. That is in Jewish law. Anyone claims to be God. But for the Roman government and for, for Jesus himself, they don't find fault with this man. They don't find any fault of him because he's not doing anything. He's a gentle man who is taught people only to obey their governments, right? So they have a hard time accusing him before Pilate. But we get a lot more out of this conversation in John. So if you read for us, Henry, John 18, 28 through 38.
And then they led Jesus from Caiaphas' house into the common hall. Now it was morning, and they themselves went not into the common hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out unto them, and said, What accusation bring ye against this man? And they answered and said to him, If he were not an evildoer, would we not have delivered him unto thee? Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, and judge him after your own law. Then the Jews said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death. It was that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled which he spake, signifying what death he should die. So Pilate entered into the common hall again, and said to Jesus, Art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus said to him, Sayest thou that of thyself, or did others tell it to thee of me? And Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the high priest have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? And Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would surely fight, that I should not be delivered unto the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Then Pilate said to him, Art thou a king then? And Jesus answered, Thou sayest I am a king. For this cause am I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. Pilate said unto him, What is the truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews, and said unto him, I find no cause at all.
Thank you very much. So we see just really the same kind of idea where Pilate confronts Jesus and he says, you've said it, really puts it back to Pilate, trying to convince Pilate to say, what do you say I am? Never outright claiming to be king, where he certainly does say, my kingdom is not of this world, that he is a king, but he's not trying to proclaim himself as king over Rome. So Pilate, recognizing that, hey, this man is not king or claiming to be king, he finds no fault in it. And so what actually happens here is not the immediate washing his hands and sending Jesus away. We actually get another circumstance from what Luke actually discovers for us. After in verse 5 of Luke 23, where they say, oh, Jesus has been stirring up trouble from Galilee to here, Pilate goes, oh, thank goodness he's from Galilee. I don't have to deal with this. So go ahead and read for us Isaiah Luke 23, 6 through 12, please.
And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself was also at Jerusalem at the time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things about him, and he had hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod with his men of war set him at naught and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. And the same day Pilate and Herod made friends together, for before they were at enemy between themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. So what we have here is really a difference in jurisdiction. There's two governors that are in the area of what we call Israel. These are not by any means like two scale lines, but essentially you can look at the northern half of Israel being under the jurisdiction of Herod, where the Judean section being under the governance of Pilate. All of the sections of Rome had different governors over them and at different times. So Pilate, when he hears he's from Galilee, he's like, oh, not from my jurisdiction, maybe I can pass the buck here. And he sends him to Herod, who's fortunately right in Jerusalem at the time. I believe both Pilate, maybe not Pilate, but I believe that I know that Herod claimed some level of Jewish ancestry. And so to show face, whether or not he was actually a practicing Jew, he certainly was not.
He just came for the food, Pastor.
Maybe. They have to be at Passover to show face, to make themselves appear in a good way before the Jewish people, which brings them together at the same point in time. And so really, for where Jesus actually interacted with Pilate, we see that Jesus has nothing to do with this man Herod. And really, it's not ultimately up to Herod to make the decision. Where Herod's like, oh, I'd love to see him do some miracles for me. I'd love to know Jesus.
Before a monkey?
Right. And we're looking at the same Herod who sentenced John the Baptist to death, who beheaded John the Baptist. It's this same man who's like, oh, I'd love to hear more about this Jesus that everyone's talking about. Because remember, Herod was confused as to who he was. But after he absolutely refuses to speak to him, they mock him as a king by putting on a priest or a gorgeous robe on him and sending him back to Pilate. And it's this mockery, this really, if anything, it's kind of more a persuasion towards agreeance with the Jews, which brings Herod and Pilate together, kind of leading Pilate in the direction of, well, he says he's a king, we'll condemn him as a king. Go ahead, Isaiah.
I find it funny that at the end of that section of Luke, it's just like, oh yeah, Pilate and Herod became friends because of this.
Yeah. Which, for the Jewish reader, it would give some context as to, the politics of the day and age. So, this is, I guess it's a good enough place to stop. From this point, really the next interaction with Pilate is where Jesus is condemned and then sentenced out to the cross. And so, we'll stop here for a moment. I will have some stuff to do once we pray. We'll talk a little bit about the differences of the Gospels and go into a little bit more detail.
It does make
I
me
don't
laugh.
think I've clarified enough some of the details between the Gospels. But go ahead.
It does make me laugh that Herod isn't even mentioned in Mark, or at least from what I'm looking at, because it was such a nothing burger thing that happened. It was like a waste of everyone's 30 minutes.
Right. But Luke is starting to record it as
The
as history
historian.
would account for it, right? So absolutely. Yeah, let's take a moment and pray, guys, and we'll talk a little bit more. Father, we thank you for this time together and for the Word of God, which is it's just so complete and so full, Lord, and it is infallible, and we read it this morning, trusting what it says, but more importantly, Lord, desiring to be changed by it. We use your word to guide us, to change us, and to allow us to walk more deeply with you. We thank you for this time. Ask your blessing now in the rest of our service today, in Jesus' name. Thank you very much, guys. All right, quick chat though, because I don't think I clarified this enough when we talk about the Gospels. We talk about how we believe the Gospels are written, and the order of which they are written. So we really begin with two important documents, okay? Mark is obviously the first gospel ever written.
Cues from Star Trek. You can't fool me.
Mark is the first gospel written, and everything he includes is largely in Matthew and Luke. There are a few things that aren't included, but almost everything in Mark is included in Matthew and Luke. We believe this to be John Mark. We're pretty confident, we're like almost completely confident this is John Mark, who was very closely associated with Peter. So probably a lot of the accounts of Mark come from Peter. So it was more like a secondhand account of Peter's gospel. It's largely Jesus did this. It is a communication of things that are happening. Now Matthew comes along, and Luke, we believe they're kind of written around the same time. Largely the stories that are included in Matthew and Luke are similar. And not only the parts that are included in Mark, but also the teachings. So scholars presume there to be a document that is lost to us, which includes largely the teachings of Jesus. Now there's no real evidence for this other than what we find in Matthew and Luke, which are teachings of Jesus. So it's presumed that these two gospels use these two sources primarily to compose their gospels. Again, this is all like suppositional, but this is like the largely accepted belief when it comes to scholarly looks at the New Testament. And a teaching document labeled Q is what is used to compile along with Mark to write these secondary gospels. The only other, Luke includes more than Matthew does, but you were right, Becky, before that Luke is a historian, whereas Matthew is like a direct disciple of Jesus. Luke is more associated with Paul and writes as a historian. He's actually a physician, but he tells Theophilus in his gospel, hey, I am writing this as a compilation of everything I've seen. So most likely Luke had other sources besides them, although these are the main ones. Your thoughts?
I was gonna make sure that Matthew
Oh,
was
okay.
the Matthew.
Yes, that is the Matthew. John is the John, the disciple that followed Jesus, and he comes way later.
It's not John the
Probably-
Baptist?
Not John the Baptist, because he's dead halfway through the gospel.
I think it's
John
just
the
a big
Apostle probably writes from the island of Patmos near his death, between when he's exiled and writes Revelation and his death. That's probably when he does the majority of his writings. And so this comes way later. Way later.
He had a lot
And
of
this
time
is-
to go over it too.
Yeah, so he probably looked at Mark and Matthew and Luke, and rather than saying, well, I'm just going to make another account, he says, let me tell you of the things that the others don't tell you about. Which is why we get John, who's so different, but not a contradiction, just more detail in a lot of cases as to the things that are being fulfilled. So that is a quick overlook as to what is happening timeline-wise and the time that they were written and how, and the purpose of all of the writings. Yeah, any questions or thoughts on that? Yeah, go ahead, Don.
It's like different people at different times observe, and what they see is different.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, what I would see and what you would see depends, I mean, like Matthew, or Luke was an historian.
Yeah,
He would see things different than what Matthew would, because
Yeah.
he's thinking of the history of everything,
right.
where the others are just thinking maybe of the people that were there,
Yes.
or something else like that.
Yeah.
So that makes each perspective a little different.
Because it's not just how they're writing, but it's also to whom they're writing. Mark writes, just generally, and records these events. Matthew writes specifically to Jewish people that this is your Messiah. he is the Christ, the Messiah. Luke, as a Gentile worker, writes to a more broad populace, not necessarily including all the verse references that Matthew does, but writes, like you say, to everybody, as a historian, right? To Gentiles, probably in particular. And then John writes to Jewish people in particular, including a lot of the references like Matthew, is like, here's the scripture he fulfills. But he proclaims him to be the Son of God, more of in a different, just a little different perspective than the rest of them. But you're right that every one of them has a different viewpoint, lens. So where Mark records the event in question, right, the accusations as a maid, a different maid, and the group of people that accuse him, and Matthew's largely the same. Luke records it as a maid, a man, and then the group again, right? So, which is similar, but Luke, it's labeled as a man, but it's kind of just more like I'm sorry, this is a man. Sorry, this is the way that Luke said, if I remember correctly. He doesn't even say maid, he says a different person entirely, and he just kind of leaves it general. And then his last accusation is not a group, but a man. Where then John clarifies a maid, a different maid, and he calls who this man is. So you see the development over time, where it goes from more generic to less generic to very specific. Here's this maid, here is this man, and the middle person is still kind of whoever. But you see that progression.
Middle child. You know how those middlemen are.
Yeah, so hopefully that clarifies. It's both a who's writing when, but also what they're using and how they're getting their information from, which matters in this situation like this. Go ahead.
So, a couple things. In addition to Luke being a historian, he, as you said, was associated with Paul, which is why more of the Jewish politics is involved. Not only as a historian, but the Jewish politics
Yes.
from Paul,
Yes.
who knew, he was part of the same union, right? Paul? Or
His name what?
No, he was just a
No.
Pharisee.
Just a Pharisee?
No, yeah, just
Okay.
a Pharisee.
Okay.
He was a
Gamaliel
high-ranking
was his
High-ranking
teacher.
Pharisee, okay.
Yeah.
Benjamite.
And
Yeah.
Mark's account, well, Peter's account through
Yeah.
Mark,
Yeah.
was likely the first one written, so it was, we need to get this information out to the people.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew's was, I need to convince the Jewish people that he is the Messiah. Luke, with the influence of Paul and being a Gentile, is getting it out to everyone.
Yeah.
Because Paul's mission wasn't to the Jews, it was to everyone.
Yeah.
And then John, and you had Mark just get it out to the people, much like Peter's personality, just get the information out to everybody. Matthew and Luke, all written in a shorter amount of time. Matthew and Luke, but Matthew's clarifying what Mark had said. Luke's clarifying everything for the Gentiles who don't know Jewish politics, who don't know the Jewish side of this.
Yeah.
Asking how do I as a Gentile hear from the Jews to then tell the Gentiles what this is.
Yeah.
And then John it's been decades for us to sit on this.
Mm-hmm.
I have the time, I've been exiled.
Yeah.
Let's clarify everything and make it known, make it more complete.
Yeah.
Fu-
Yeah.
I don't want to say fulfill, but perfect the rest of the Gospels with more information.
Right.
And it's a much more emotionally attached telling because he had the time. He was a disciple who Jesus loved. And it's not get the information out, Jesus as the Messiah, Jesus as a historical figure to explain to the Gentiles. It's, this is my friend, this is how you have a personal relationship.
Very
with God.
good. It's a personal. That was my thought. It was you're speaking. It's a personal account. Goes into more about who Jesus is, as well as John including himself personally in the story. You're absolutely right. Yeah. So you guys got a good picture of this. I think knowing the progression of when they write, as well as like the purpose of the writing and their audience, makes a big difference.
And
So you
John
guys
makes
got it.
the disciples
Yeah.
and Mary and Martha, everyone involved people instead of figures,
Yeah.
which helps your connection. You can put yourself in, oh, what was Peter thinking? Oh, what was Mary thinking?
Right.
Oh, what was this? What was that?
Yeah.
To to help with your personal connection with God and not a list of what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. It is much more for you to come to.
Which is why Mark is clearly the best gospel.
But you're right too that Luke also includes a lot of the politics as a proof of these things happen. Like go to the Roman documents and look at what happened. Like you can see these events all occur. So there's a lot more politics in Luke for the historical purposes. But you're right, John's gospel is very personal. Yeah.
A couple things. Number one about the crowd, which I was going to say before we were cut off.
Yeah.
It's likely that a crowd did all accuse Peter because, Luke mentions that it was like an hour time between, so he could have just been like getting it constantly from.
But it started with a man.
It started with a maid, ended with a man, and then just Peter got fed up about it. Like, I don't know, man, I don't know.
Yeah.
But more so, like now about the Gospels, something Rebecca kind of touched upon is because these seemingly contradictions actually make them seem more plausible because there's like undesigned coincidences throughout the entire Gospels. I mean, like, I think Luke mentions like a specific location that Philip was from, but doesn't mention Philip was from that location. And then John, Jesus asked Philip specifically, like, hey, what do you think would be a good spot to like do things? And Philip's just like, oh yeah, over there, like something like that.
Yeah. I don't know exactly which one you're referring to, but you're right. It adds more. It goes on to give more clarification. So. Yeah. There's a. So I hope that clarifies the perspective on the accusations. But that's kind of the background we need to help flesh that all out together as to who's more specific and who's less. So, thanks, Harry. Good chat. Not that you weren't already released, but you're extra released.